right. Hi, welcome to the Clarke Historical Museum. Our presentation today is done by Jerry Rohde, and it's titled Vanished Villages. Jerry?
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to be back here at the Clarke again. It's one of my favorite places to do indoor programs because they have this wonderful lentil 3D map on their wall here. It's about 12 feet high and about 6 or 7 feet wide. And it shows all of Humboldt County as it was in the 1910s with a little bit of updating that was made in the 1940s. So it's a historical object in its own right, but it really helps us with being able to go back and help you understand some of the local history from kind of a geographical perspective. So what we're going to do today is look around the county, and I'm going to talk about some of the older towns, communities that were started mostly in the late 19th century, and today they're pretty much ghost towns or abandoned stretches of empty space because things have changed so drastically for those towns in the last 100 years. And we'll talk a little about why the towns were there to begin with and why they're no longer active communities. But before we do that, I'd like to just go over a little bit of the county's topography with folks so you get a bit of an idea what the general trend of the land is here and how that would have an effect on the development of the towns and the roads, the railroads, the different things that were started in the 1850s and gradually came to dominate the landscape. So if you look at this map, you'll see that these blue lines are rivers or very large creeks. We've got the Main Eel River down here in the south part of the county and coming out to the coast west of Ferndale. And we have the Van Duzen River that goes almost due west until it meets the Main Eel River over near the little town of Alton. We have the Mad River, of course, goes through Blue Lake, but once again, it's going from the southeast up to the northwest, and that's the trend of just about all of these streams and rivers that go through Humboldt County. Redwood Creek, which is probably bigger than several of the rivers in Humboldt County, but it was named as a creek, and it's been that way ever since. You can see how it goes to come out at the ocean near the town of Orick, and it's on that northwest course, just like the rest of them. And then the South Fork of the Trinity River that comes through Trinity County and gets up to a point where it actually forms the county line between Trinity County, that's the gray area over here on the right, and then Humboldt County, which is the colored, very colored areas to the left. And where the main Trinity comes in at the little town of Salyer, South Fork meets it there. And then as the main Trinity River, it goes down to the community of Witchpeck where the Trinity flows into the Klamath River. And once again, that river then goes out to the northwest. So you have these major village or valleys with stream systems in them, almost all of them trending on that northwest to southeast line. And of course, in between the valleys, you've got the ridges that are separating the different drainage systems, and they do the same type of thing, follow that same pattern. So we're back in 1850, and the first whites have landed at Humboldt Bay and have started setting up communities there to supply the gold miners who are out on the Klamath River in Humboldt County, up in Siskiyou County, or different parts of the Trinity River as you get farther inland, or the Salmon River, which goes into the Klamath near the town of Orleans. So it's quite a distance between Humboldt Bay and these mining locations, but most of the business that was being done in the first few years of the county revolved around supplying the miners, developing ranches that would supply beef and other products that the miners could eat, bringing in supplies to the ports on the edge of Humboldt Bay, and taking supplies and equipment out to the river areas in these different locations. What that meant was that you had to go kind of up and down. You had to go up one of these ridges, come down the other side, go up another ridge, come down, and a lot of times you had to maybe take a kind of circuitous route because some of these slopes are really steep, and you wouldn't be able to just go straight up them with a heavily loaded pack mule, or probably die of a heart attack before it got to the top. But the whole trend was, like say from Humboldt Bay or Trinidad Bay up here, was to get east and northeast by going up and down almost like a roller coaster to get to these different locations. And when you're down in more in southern Humboldt County, you're then trying to supply, once again from Humboldt Bay mostly, some of the mines over in Trinity County, way over even toward the Weaverville area. It turned out that you could supply some of those places quicker and easier from the coast than if you went up the Central Valley and then backtracked from the Redding area or Red Bluff and places like that. So pretty much about 3/4 of Humboldt County was devoted to trails that went either into Trinity County or up into northeastern Humboldt County and Siskiyou County. But way down here at the south, down near the Mendocino County line, there were some supply routes there that were mostly dedicated to supplying the little communities along the southern edge of Humboldt County. So to supply them, ships would land down here at Shelter Cove. It's a kind of protected port, and it has a point coming out into the ocean, kind of like at Trinidad, where Trinidad Head comes out, and it shelters ships that come into the bay there, just like up here at Trinidad, where the northwest winds, which are the prevalent winds, would bump into the mountain system or the ridge system going out into the bay, and you'd have fairly calm water inland from that. So you could come up to Shelter Cove, and a wharf was put in there, and supplies were brought onto land, and then mule train packers would fill up their cargoes of various supplies, put them on mules, and run a train of maybe 50 or more, 50 to 100 mules, to bring them inland. And from Shelter Cove, they had to make a very steep climb up to the first ridge, and then went inland to a place that almost doesn't exist anymore, the town of Bryceland. And from there, they went over a big hump in the ridge line and came out to the Garberville area. But they also would be able to continue all the way over to the tiny town of Harris in southeastern Trinity or Humboldt County, and they could even go into Trinity County a little bit on those same pack train trails. So just about all of the movement in the very early days was going to be from the ocean, from the coast, coming inland to various degrees. And so most of these trails that were developed were going to go from the west to the east, or from the southwest to the northeast. It was quite a while later before we started seeing the development of trails that were actually going north and south and trying to connect the different coastal counties. But with that as kind of a background, I want to ask you folks, and you can, if you're watching this at home, hopefully there'll be more than one of you, so somebody can keep track of the answers here. But I'd like people to think about, back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, what the most important town in southern Humboldt County would be, way southern Humboldt County. And probably people would think, well, Garberville's pretty important today, and the freeway goes right next to Garberville, and the old Redwood Highway used to go right through town, and it's a pretty good sized community. And then just downriver from that is Redway, which actually has more people in it than Garberville now. So you might think of one of those two places, but if you did, you'd be wrong, because up until about 1920, the biggest town in southern Humboldt County, it's one I mentioned already, it's this spot called Bryceland, which is about a third of the way over to the coast from Garberville on the way to Shelter Cove. And it was a stop on the pack train trail that went between those places, but what really made it important was they had a plant there that took tan bark, the bark from the tan oak tree, and processed it so that it could be shipped out of the area and shipped to leather tanneries in other parts of the state. Because up until about the 1950s, if you wanted to tan leather, you needed the tannin from some type of tree, and in this case, it was the tan oak or tan bark oak tree that provided the best tanning agent, and it came from its bark. And if you were going to do tanning, you had to have this material. And there were dozens of tanneries in California in the early days. Most of them were down in the Bay Area or over by Stockton, but sort of in the central California location. Although we actually, at various times, had at least 3 or 4 tanneries up here in Humboldt County that did kind of the local tanning. So all of the southern Humboldt County areas had some degree of tan oak inhabitancy in them. Even in the redwood forest, on this map, the redwood forest lands are shown with the kind of this pinkish color. You can see kind of a big band of it here. And then the Douglas fir, which is in the dark green. There'd often be mixed in those forests a lot of tan oak trees. And also in some of the sort of prairie lands that still had some oaks and various trees around the edges, like along the Mattole River. So these guys that were called tan barkers would go out, kind of like the redwood loggers did, and start up a logging camp out in an area where they wanted to cut down the tan bark trees. And they do this in May when sap was still running in the trees. It usually worked in 2-man crews. They would go out to the area that they had the rights to cut the tan bark oak trees down. And one of the guys would take his axe and he'd start a couple of feet above the ground, well, about 4 feet above the ground, and make a slice vertically in the bark of that tree that was about 4 feet high. And then, using the axe, they would actually be able to peel that whole section of bark that went around the tree, and it would come off at that time of year pretty easily. And once they'd made that first cut like that, then they'd chop the whole tree down and make those same kind of slices on the rest of the trunk and the big limbs, and peel off the rest of the large pieces of bark. And they just leave them there out in the tan oak forest during the hot months of summer. And then what was happening is the moisture was being withdrawn, kind of baked out of these pieces of tan bark. And remember, so they're about 4 feet long, and you might have a tree that was, a couple of feet in diameter, and so you'd have a pretty big section of bark laying on the ground. But gradually, as the bark lost its moisture, that bark would start curling up. And by late summer, end of summer, you'd have it all rolled up, kind of like a parchment scroll that, somebody would pull open and then read from. And also it lost a lot of its weight, it lost all the moisture. So then the tan bark crews would come back, and they would load up mules with as much tan bark as they could pile on them. And that wasn't going to be a very heavy load. It took up a lot of space. But remember, this tan bark by now has most of the weight gone from it, most of the moisture. And then the mules would take these loads down to a place, first place they could get to where there was a road. And there they would have wagons, big wagons with a big central area that they could put the bark in. And once again, the weight wasn't the problem, and they would put some slats up on the side of the wagon to hold the bark in place. And then those wagons would bring the tan bark out to the next place. And there was a choice, or depended on where you're going to do it. But if you're in the Mattole Valley, here's the Mattole River down here. I forgot to mention it, but it's another one that kind of goes from the southeast to the northwest. And west of the little town of Petrolia, they actually had a wharf that went partway out in the ocean where they could load tan bark onto small steamships that came up. And because, once again, the tan bark was so lightweight, they could just send it in a kind of a gondola out from the wharf to the ship that was out beyond the rocks. in that location. So that was one way you could do it. You could just take the whole rolled up piece of tan bark and send the whole thing down to the different leather tanneries. But another system was you could, if you're down a little farther in southern Humboldt, you could take those rolled up pieces of tan bark by wagon and take them down to the wharf at Shelter Cove. And down there was a tan bark grinding machine on the wharf. And you could feed the rolls of tan bark in there, and it'd be ground up there and kind of pulverized, and they could put them in wooden barrels, and a much more compact way of moving the tan bark to another location. But then there was a third way, and that's where Bryceland over here shows up. There was a leather company owned by the Wagner family, and it was in Stockton, and they had been cutting tan bark down close to the coast south of San Francisco, but they ran out. And so the Wagners came up here and picked out tan bark areas where they wanted to cut, and they either bought the land or they bought the right to cut the tan bark. And so any of the tan bark that was cut on their property was brought in to Bryceland, and there they had a processing station, a great big complex of buildings, where first of all they would grind up the tan bark, and then they would put them in these big kind of, it was almost like a wading pool, very long and fairly narrow, but they could put in a layer of the tan bark that had been kind of ground up part way already, and then they would soak it. And then they would move the tan bark into another tank and keep soaking it. And every time they would get a certain amount of the tannin leaching out of the bark. And so then they would put this kind of syrupy liquid into a barrel and close up the barrel, and then take the barrels, which wasn't just the crushed tan bark now, it was this kind of syrup. They'd take that down to Shelter Cove and send it to Stockton for the Wagner Company. So, because there was so much activity going on with that tan barking plant there in Bryceland, that actually became, for probably a little over 20 years, the most active location in southern Humboldt. Finally, about 1920, the Wagner family was running out of places to cut more tan bark. They could still buy some more land or buy the rights to harvest on the land, but they now realized that instead of having to take it out to Shelter Cove and take it by ship, they could use the new Redwood Highway, which had been built in the 1910s and was coming over. Okay, so here's Bryceland, and you go over this one kind of humpy ridge, and you get to Garberville, and that's where the Redwood Highway was. The problem is, from Bryceland in the old days, you had to go over this ridge, and it's fairly steep grade, especially coming out of Bryceland, and then get down to the South Fork Eel River and get to the highway in the Garberville area. Well, the Wagners didn't think that was going to work. This grade was going to be too steep for the wagons. So they contacted the county, and they asked that the county put a connecting road from Bryceland over here to where the town of Redway developed. And if you've ever driven out that way, that's the way you go now to Shelter Cove. You normally would just go from Redway up this canyon where Redwood Creek is. Well, the county said they didn't want to do it. So the Wagner family said, okay, well, that's it. And so they pulled the plug on the Bryceland operation in about 1921. And I think by 1922, they were done there. And so all of the workers that had gathered around there and were being employed by the Wagner Company had to go somewhere else if they wanted to find work. And that was the point where Bryceland started its decline. After a time period, the saloons closed, the hotels closed. About the only noticeable building in town that had a real presence was what they called their tin store. It was a general mercantile store that had corrugated metal sides on it, like they put on the roof sometimes. And that actually helped protect it from fire. Gradually, everything else closed, and finally that store closed. And so if you drive through Bryceland today, you'll see a few old houses, but really no sign of the business district or the school, places like that. So I think that would qualify as one of our vanished villages. You'd have to go back just about a century. If you went back, to 1922, 100 years ago, the plant was still standing. It had just stopped processing the tan bark the year before, and so you'd still have almost everything there. But 100 years' time, and without anything really to take the place of the tan bark. Now, maybe if they'd done things a little more quickly, there could have been some kind of cannabis processing plant there, because certainly there's been a lot of growing going on down there, but they missed that opportunity, and now Bryceland is just sort of a wide spot in the road between Redway and Shelter Cove. Okay, so that's vanished village number 1. Let's look around a little more down here in southern Humboldt before we go farther north. Bryceland is a little ways away from the Mattole River, but a few miles driving towards Shelter Cove will get you there. And if you go down the Mattole River on its way towards Petrolia and the Mattole Valley, there's a spot called Ettersburg. I'll point to it right here. And it was never a really big community, but a man by the name of Albert Etter and several of his brothers settled there and developed an agricultural experiment station. Etter was, he's sometimes called the Luther Burbank of Humboldt County. He was very good at developing new strains of especially apples and strawberries. And he had a lot of vacant land there, a lot of water, and it was fairly warm, actually hot in the summertime, so good growing conditions for some of his experiments. And over time, he developed dozens of new strains of strawberries and apples. Some of the ones that we still see in the market, like the King apple or the Waltana, are sometimes sold in the local markets, at least places like the Co-op that have some of the local apples. And he did a number of strawberries, including one that was really interesting. He found a native strawberry growing out on the coast north of Petrolia, up towards Cape Mendocino, and he crossed it with a strawberry that originally came from Switzerland. And it turned out, for some reason, to be a really good strawberry, and I think it's still, being farmed today and being used. It's probably one of his best achievements in the work he did there. But by the 1940s, he was getting old. He wasn't getting nurseries to stock his different strains. He wasn't very successful in getting people to become interested in raising Etter strawberries or Etter apples. And once he passed away, his experimental area was pretty much just abandoned for a period of time. In recent years, families, name is Fishman, have gone out there and have tried to resurrect some of Albert Etter's most effective hybridizations. But there's really nothing much out there anymore. For a time, you had a store. I should tell you about the store, because it was never a really big community, but there was a landowner there that allowed a store to be built on a corner of his property. I think the guy was a rancher. And so there was this fairly small building that had a very small general store. And the fellow that operated the store got the idea that Ettersburg should have a post office. So he applied for a post office, and it was approved. And then he thought, well, we're not doing that much business. I'll just put the post office. It'll be just a little corner of the store. And that happened in a lot of these small communities where that was the kind of meeting place for folks anyway. And so all you needed was a space not much bigger than a closet, and you could have a few mailboxes there and sell stamps and have your post office. So he started doing that, and the the landowner objected. He didn't want that building used for a post office. And so he told the store operator that you can't do that in my building. So the store operator said, fine. He went over and got a little piece of property across the street, built a new store, and had the post office there. So that's how they kept the Edwardsburg post office going for a while. Then this fella, he was Portuguese, I believe, and his first name was Onofino, O-N-O-F-I-N-O, I think. But his nickname, or his shortened name, was On, which is very confusing. I've been trying to write this in books, and I use capital O-N, and then someone will read it and they won't understand this is a person's name unless you give them this whole story. So anyway, On decided that he didn't want to stay in Edwardsburg, so he moved down to Whitethorn, a town kind of between Bryceland and Shelter Cove, and opened the store there. And sure enough, he started a new post office, and then he was happy. And the guy that, was unhappy with the post office up in Edwardsburg, well, he didn't have On to deal with anymore, so I guess he was happy too. Okay, let's look around here. I'm just going to jump around a few places down in southern Humboldt. One of the most dramatic changes took place in this canyon here called, it's actually the Canyon of Bull Creek. It's one of the bigger side streams in southern Humboldt, and there's kind of a semicircle formed by the mountains around Bull Creek drainage, and there's that drainage is about 25,000 acres, so it's quite a bit here. It comes out onto the South Fork of the Eel River, pretty close to where the South Fork meets the main fork. Closest town would be the little town of Weot, about 3 miles up from there. And it started out as a ranching and farming area in the 19th century. There were a lot of hillside prairies, and there was some fairly flat land down near Bull Creek where you could raise things, especially apples. One of the fellows that grew apples out there, Amos Cummings, actually won a medal for his apples down at the Apple Fair in San Francisco in 1915. So you could grow apples there, and they transport, of course, a lot better than soft fruits like peaches and plums, and they store well. So the ranchers down there could actually take their apples into the Humboldt Bay area and sell them there. And they didn't get rich at it, but they did manage to supplement their income. So that was one of the first things that was happening there, and there was a little bit of ranching, and then gradually it became a timber area. The Rockefeller Forest, which is part of Humboldt Redwood State Park, is down in the lower stretch of Bull Creek, and so once that was preserved as part of Humboldt Redwood State Park, you couldn't log that, but there's a whole bunch of land up above that, mixed forest, fir and redwood, plus some other types of trees that weren't commercially so valuable. And especially after World War II, the loggers went in there. The tan barkers had already been in there in the early 1900s, and taken out most of the tan oak. Then the fir cutters came in and started cutting Douglas fir heavily after World War II, and you had several mills there. And the combination of having cut the tan bark, now cutting the fir, and cutting some redwood that wasn't protected in the park really created a problem with the landscape, because they put in not just the haul roads that the trucks would drive on to take the logs out, but the haul roads, but then they also had the secondary roads that they would actually, a lot of times they couldn't even drive on them, but they would skid logs down the hillside, and it formed kind of a road where they get them to the place where they could be put on a truck. And if you look at aerial photos from the 1950s, it just looks like there's a black plate and somebody dropped a bunch of spaghetti on it, because there's all this crisscrossing and curving of these light lines, and all of those lines are some type of logging road that was put in during that time period. So first of all, they were removing all the vegetation, and there's nothing any longer to hold the earth in place or to protect the earth from a real heavy rain like the limbs and needles of a fir tree would do. And then they're putting in this road system, and each of those roads became kind of like an instant culvert when it filled up with water. And so you had a kind of artificial drainage system that was taking heavier amounts of water that weren't being dropped and allowed to settle on the ground and rushing it downstream at a very intense pace. So 1955, they've been at work out there for about 8 or 10 years pretty heavily, and that's when we had one of the big floods, the century, what they would call a once-in-a-century flood. And it just created enormous damage in Bull Creek. There was a town with a population of about 300 people, and a lot of them lost their homes. No one was killed. They managed to get out in time, but it was a close call for some of them because about the only way you could get out was going down the canyon until you got to the state highway. And meanwhile, what's happening in the canyon? All the water is coming down and knocking out the bridges. So that happened, and then 9 years later, they had the 1,000-year flood, as it was called, in 1964, more of the same thing. And so it was really destroying the soil and vegetation in the upper canyon, but the force with which it was coming downstream was so great that it was also killing some of the redwoods. They figured out that about 500 really big old-growth redwoods, the kind that might be 250, 300 feet tall, had been destroyed by those floods. And so now the Save the Redwoods League and the state park and conservationists who really wanted to protect the redwood forest became really concerned about preserving the trees down there in the Rockefeller Forest. And it was decided that the state would buy up all of the private property in this whole drainage here, all 25,000 acres, and make it part of Humboldt Redwood State Park. And a lot of the folks didn't want to leave. They were paid for their property, but they would much rather have preferred to stay there and continue their small ranching operations and things like that. But by 1984, so 20 years after that last big flood, the state had completed the purchase of every acre in that drainage. And then they began a process, or were already involved in it, of removing those roads and kind of scarifying the hillsides and putting in different types of blockages that would prevent the water from rushing down so much, doing some replanting of trees. And nowadays, the forest is regenerating. It's not going to be cut again because it's part of the state park, and it'll be a long time before you have an old-growth forest in Bull Creek. But what you do have now is a protected area, and all of these hundreds, thousands of old-growth redwoods in the lower part of the canyon are going to be safe from those massive flood events. I was down there working on a contract with the park. We had to do a historical survey of some of this property before they went in and removed the logging roads. And it was amazing to go out there in these areas that had been logged, and now some very small trees, maybe 10 feet, 15, 20 feet high, had started to grow up. But under them was this pattern, the crisscrossing of the skid roads and the haul roads going down. They were still there, and you could see where over the years they just made these gullies. They just would, the soil there was very movable. It didn't adhere well to the base, and you could just see where they'd created all these new runways for the water to go downstream. And even now, when they had small trees as a vegetation cover, they were still having a lot of problems. But I think I did that about 15 years ago, and since then they've removed almost all of those skid roads and the haul roads from the area, so they've helped eliminate another problem. So another type of community was several of them that got their, not necessarily their start, but came to be really important communities in southern Humboldt when the railroad went in. In 1914, they completed the Northwestern Pacific Railroad, so you could go from Humboldt Bay down to the north side of San Francisco Bay, where they had a terminal at Sausalito and another one at Tiburon. You could take the train about 285 miles and finally get through all of the counties. You could go through Marin County and Sonoma and Mendocino County and get up to Humboldt County. And this meant that you no longer had to rely on ships to bring in all the supplies and passengers, and that was often a difficult trip, especially in winter, and especially if you're in a sailing ship and were trying to sail against the wind. And then you also, when the railroad went in, got access to a whole lot of places where it was really difficult to put in a road, but the railroad served that purpose. Say down here where the South Fork of the Eel splits off from the main fork, they had to make a very big decision. The people that were going to put in the rail line pretty much agreed, well, come down from Eureka, follow the Eel River up to the South Fork. But then they had a question, where do we go from there? Do we go up the South Fork of the Eel or do we go up the main fork? And before the railroad was started, both the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific Railroad wanted their own separate rail line to come from San Francisco up to Humboldt Bay. And so they each sent out a crew of surveyors to decide, well, what's the best route? And they thought for a while, well, we'll each put in a rail line. You can imagine that, 2 rail lines coming up here instead of 1. And the Santa Fe surveyors and engineers thought that the South Fork was the best route to take, and the Southern Pacific engineers and surveyors thought that the main fork was. And then, before they really got working in earnest on the railroad, those 2 companies came to their senses and said, there's not going to be enough traffic for us to go in competition, have 2 separate lines and all the expense. So they joined together and formed the Northwestern Pacific Railroad. These 2, almost nationwide, or at least Western United States-based rail companies. And they went with, well, then what they did was they had their own set of engineers and surveyors, and they went out with the previous engineers from the Santa Fe and from the Southern Pacific and looked at both those routes again, and after they looked at and compared them, they decided that the train line should go up the main fork of the Eel. And once they made that decision, it meant that nothing else was going to be able to go there because the canyon's too narrow, you don't have room for both a roadway and a highway, and so the state was kind of lagging behind with its highway system, at least in terms of getting a right-of-way, and once the rail line chose this route, it meant that the Redwood Highway was going to have to go on the South Fork of the Eel like it is today. So anyway, they built the rail line in 1914. It's more or less functioning, although right when they first built it, they had some problems with washouts, and it continued, for years thereafter because it is a very difficult topography and a geologic area that they were going through. So when they did have the line completed, though, there were several towns, Alder Point down here in kind of the southeastern part of the county, Fort Seward, a brand new town that they developed simply because the rail line was going to go through there, a little place called Eel Rock where you could have a little bit of fruit growing and have a summer vacation spot, and on up to Camp Grant, where they grew a lot of agricultural products, and then finally meeting the South Fork of the Eel and going down in places like Red Crest and Pepperwood, Stafford, and then on to Scotia, and on up through the Eel River Valley and over Table Bluff. But several of these communities really had to rely on the railroad to get their supplies. I think maybe the best example, or one I'll talk about at least, is Fort Seward down here. So here's Fort Seward at a bend in the river, but to get there by car, even today, let's say you're in Garberville, you have to go way up high to the ridge line. This ridge is called Mail Ridge because there used to be a mail carrier's route along it. And then you have to go several miles to the north along the ridge and then drop about 7 miles down a very steep grade to get to Fort Seward. Or if you're coming, say, from the Van Dusen River area, you also have a pretty difficult route through Bridgeville and Blocksburg and getting down there. So it wasn't going to be a place that mule trains and wagons would get to easily. It probably wouldn't have ever been anything more than ranch land, except suddenly you have the railroad going through. And a company that was formed in Oakland, included the mayor of Oakland, Frank Mott, bought a bunch of the land. There's a big flat here in this bend in the river. They bought that up and they drew up plans, and they were going to have wide streets and all these business lots and then like acre lots for fancy houses. And they even put out a poster that said, Fort Seward, soon to be the second largest city in Humboldt County. Well, they went through all of this stuff and turned out, no, people didn't want to live there, even if they had the railroad. People would come up, and they had a nice craftsman-style hotel there, so they could stay over in luxury for a week or two, but that wasn't enough to really keep the community going. And it never got very big. When I went down there for the first time about 30 years ago, they had an abandoned train station. They had the ruins of the hotel, which had burned down by then. They had an abandoned school, and they had an abandoned Shell gas station. And that was about as big as the town ever got. That was probably in the 1930s, 1940s, when all of those things were functioning. But nowadays, none of those are operational. There's no business in Fort Seward. There is, of course, a road that takes you across the river and connects with one of the routes that goes up to Blocksburg and Bridgeville. So, of course, even with the railroad there, a place like Fort Seward couldn't thrive. And of course, now the railroad has ceased operating and hasn't functioned for about 25 years in any capacity. And as we see now, it probably will never be opened again. And so there's very little chance that a place like Fort Seward would ever come back to being anything. If you drive down there, though, at least last time I was there, you can still see this old Shell gas station, and they have one of those big Shell signs. You know, it's a circular sign with it's a golden shell, and then in red it says Shell on it. And I'm surprised that someone hasn't just taken a gun and blasted that apart, because you know they love shooting up signs. But it's been there as long as I can remember, and it'd be a nice summer trip. You can actually. They used to call it going around the block, and you go through Blocksburg and come back along Mail Ridge and back up to the Eel River and Humboldt Bay. So you had some places like that that are never going to function again as a real community. Alder Point still has a store down there. It's kind of a scary place. I went down there and I felt almost like I was in some kind of inner city with all sorts of drug dealers around and burned out hulks of cars. And it was really one of the grimmer places that I've been to. And so I haven't been back there in about 10 years, but you could not say it's a ghost town yet, but it was at a time a fairly important rural town. And now it's, like I say, except for the gas station and post office, there's almost nothing there. Well, I think I'm going to move a little farther north so we make sure we cover more of the areas before the program's over. There's a lot more we could do in southern Humboldt, but let's go up a little farther, and there's some actual ghost towns or ghost places that you can, say if you live in Eureka or around Humboldt Bay, that you can reach pretty easily with a nice day drive. For example, you could come from Eureka and get down to the Eel River and go across Fern Bridge. And nowadays, when you do that, you're only going to see one real town on the south side of the river there, and that's Ferndale, of course. And that's a very interesting community that takes you back in time just when you look at all the Victorian buildings and the landscape there that's been preserved. But there's also the sites of several other little communities there that you might not even notice or be very aware of as you drive around the outskirts. So if you're in Ferndale and you go out to the coast where Centerville Beach is, there was actually a small town there that in the 1860s was considered more important than Ferndale. That's because there was a route that went up the coast. If you were, let's see, let me find a good spot here. Bear River, which is over the ridge from Ferndale, they had a lot of dairies in Bear River in the 19th century, and they were producing butter. And people outside of Bear River wanted Bear River butter, and the way that it got anywhere was it left the Bear River Valley, and there was actually a road that went through the hills and came out on the beach south of Centerville. They called it the Beach Road. For 5 miles, you just drove your buggy or your wagon across the sand. And you had to time it pretty well. There were people that drowned or were injured because they weren't aware of the high tide that was coming, or there could have been a sneaker wave. And heaven help you if there was a tsunami that hit. And of course, there would be no warning in those days. So for a number of years, that's what was happening. Out to the coast, about 5 miles below Centerville. When you got to Centerville here, you could take a road to take you to Ferndale, and there was a ferry crossing on the Eel over near Rohnerville, not too far from where, if you know where Miranda's Rescue is on the highway south of Fortuna, the ferry crossing came right up about there, Drake Hill Road. But then there used to be a slough, it's not shown on this map, but it came right up to Centerville, and it went back down to the mouth of the Eel River. And then on the opposite side of the river, there was another slough, which isn't shown here, just a little bit of it shown. It went all the way up to the foot of Table Bluff. And so if you had a shallow draft steamship, small ship, it could go up to a dock here at Centerville and take the butter or anything else that was coming from the south and go down the slough, cross near the mouth of the Eel when it wasn't running too hard, and then go up to the foot of Table Bluff, and then you had about a mile and a half trip over the top of the bluff where they had to carry goods, and it took you to the south side of Humboldt Bay. There's actually a wharf that went out in the bay about a mile, and there was a deep channel there, so boats could come down there and pick up the goods again and bring it back up to Eureka or any of the other communities up there. So Centerville was an important stopping place along that route, and for a number of years it was considered, part of the county's main transportation infrastructure. But then it was just really too dangerous to keep using the coast route on the beach. And so in the 1890s, they built what's called the Wildcat Road up from Ferndale, and it was going to give you access all the way down to Petrolia. And funny thing was, for a few years, even after the Wildcat Road was in place, much safer. I mean, wasn't, no wave was going to wash you away from that, but it was twisty, you had to do some high climbing, and people still wanted to take the beach route. It was not everyone, but a lot of people said, it's so much easier. And apparently the sand here had been battered down in a way so it was almost like pavement most of the year round. So you could make pretty good time in a wagon. And what finally stopped these daredevils from using the beach route was, I believe it was with the 1906 earthquake, the land shifted so much here that where the road came down out of the hills and went down to the beach, there was just a big drop-off that was created, like the earth had just separated in a way that destroyed the whole access route down to the beach. And that's when they gave up on it and started using the Wildcat full-time. So there's Centerville. You know, you go out there now, and if you look around, you can see the ruins of a couple of buildings. But for a while, there was a store and a hotel out there, and a blacksmith shop, all the kind of basic buildings that you needed. In 1860, when a paddle wheel steamer called the Northerner went aground on the beach there, and I believe 38 people were killed during a terrific storm. The survivors were taken to Centerville and cared for. So it was, you know, it was a real place that had importance way beyond its size, because it connected all of these other places. And I think they called it Centerville. I always tried to figure this out, because here it is, and I think they thought it was the center between Bear River and Humboldt Bay. Halfway point, kind of. So you won't find a lot out there, but if you look around, you'll see some evidence of those buildings. And this is going to be one of the first spots. We're already noticing it, but with sea level rise, we're already getting waves that are starting to wash across the beach there at Centerville and actually into the old townside area. And then just north of Ferndale, on this side river, which is called Salt River, so about a mile north of town, not far from the fairgrounds in Ferndale, was a town called Port Kenyon. And for a few years in the late 19th century and early 20th century, ocean-going ships tried coming in the mouth of the Eel River, and if they could get across the sandbar that sometimes formed there, but sometimes was open, they could go up about 4 miles and get to this little town of Port Kenyon. And they had wharves on both sides of the river there. And so it was a place where the ranchers in this lower Eel area, like from Ferndale, anything on the south side of the Eel, they could put their goods there into ships at Port Kenyon and take it out the mouth of the Eel River and take it south to San Francisco Bay without having to worry about going up to Humboldt Bay, where they had better and more shipping facilities. The guy that was named for, John Gardner Kenyon, was a real interesting guy. He invented a type of fountain pen and had it actually patented, and it looked like it was pretty effective, but another company came along with a slightly better version, so he never made any money on his fountain pen. He was also a ventriloquist and a magician, and he would perform at different places, as part of a kind of vaudeville thing where they'd have some music and then he'd do his tricks. And so there's a story that one time he was in the Ferndale area doing one of his shows, and he had a top hat that he took off and he sat on the table. Actually, he didn't take his own top hat, but he asked for someone in the audience if he could borrow their top hat, because the men were dressed kind of formally. And Joseph Russ, who's the big landowner there, wound up with his hat on the table, turned upside down, stood on its top. And then Kenyon proceeded to break some eggs and drop them into the top hat and throw some flour in there. And then he had a little kind of a Bunsen burner type heater, and without burning the hat, he held it above that. And in his mind, he thought he was going to come out with something that was kind of like a cake, or at least, you know, something that had been baked. And he looked in there, stirred it up some more, and heated it some more. And he said, well, sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. And here's your hat back, Mr. Russ. And it had all the egg and everything else in it. So I don't think Russ ever used the hat again. And probably the audience enjoyed that trick more than if he'd actually come out with the cake. Okay, so that's Port Kenyon for you. Then he actually moved about a mile. So Port Kenyon would be just north of Ferndale. He moved about a mile up Salt River and started another town, and that's still there. It's called Arlinda Corners, and there's actually a store that still operates there. It's about a mile north of the main road that connects Fernbridge to Ferndale, because it turned out that the ships weren't able really to reliably come in and out of the mouth of the Eel, and so Port Kenyon was starting to slow down as a community. So they built this next community, but it never amounted to too much, although it still has that one business there. And then he finally gave up on Humboldt County and moved up to Washington State, and he remember this is in the 1890s, and there was a lot of land available around Puget Sound, and he bought some lots, and it turned out they became very valuable lots as the city of Seattle grew, and he became very wealthy finally, but it was after he gave up on starting towns down here. And of course, as we know, his career as a magician wasn't very successful, but at least in the end, he wound up making some money. I'm going to do a couple of more. If you wanted to go from Trinidad, which was a port city in the early days, and you wanted to get over to the rivers where they were mining, there's quite a route you took. You went up the coast, you actually went up to Big Lagoon, and you went along the spit at Big Lagoon. There was no road around the lagoon in those days, so kind of like down here on the beach road, you actually went along the packed sand, and at the upper end of Big Lagoon, there was a trail that went up into the mountains. And it's hard to see unless you're right up close like I am, but about where I'm pointing here with my laser pointer, there's a sort of dip in the ridge line that was just in back of Big Lagoon. And the trail went through that dip and dropped down into Redwood Creek and crossed Redwood Creek where the Tall Trees Grove is in Redwood National Park, and then went up the other side of the hill from, let me see if I can show you about where, to this ridge, which is where the Bald Hills Road runs. Today it was a pack train trail for a long time. Went up there, and from there you could get down to the Klamath River, cross the Klamath, and go to places like Orleans where they were mining, or Witchpeck, Bluff Creek, places like that. And the area on the northeast side of Redwood Creek, where the trail went and ran along the ridgetop for a ways, became a sheep ranching and cattle ranching area. And there never was a true town up there, but there was a post office, and there was a school, and there were a number of fairly good-sized ranches, and so the area became called the Bald Hills, and there was actually a stopping place where you could stay overnight if you were trying to get all the way over to the Klamath River. Nowadays, there's nothing up there in the way of a commercial building of any type. The park took over all of the land on the downhill side from the ridge that went down into Redwood Creek, and they kept several of the old barns up there. It's a National Historic District. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 fairly good-sized barns, or sheep sheds, as some of them are called up there, and a couple of shacks where they would go out and inspect the barbed wire lines that fenced in part of the property. So you could go up there. It's called the Lions Ranch Historic District, and still see the remnants of a ranching community. It just wasn't one that was a full-fledged town. And because the park's taken it over, they actually have rehabilitated some of those barns to keep them from falling down, and they're in pretty good shape today. If you got over onto the Klamath River, like you took the trail through the Bald Hills and dropped down, there's a spot called Martin's Ferry on the Klamath, where the old trails used to meet on both sides, and you wanted to cross the river there. And in 1861, a man by the name of Martin built a bridge across the Klamath River. And it cost him quite a bit of money. I think it was something like $5,000, and this was 1861, so it was a big deal. It was all the money he had. And he talked to the local Indians about what had happened in the past with high water, because he didn't want a problem with that. And the Indians assured him that anything that he built at a certain height would be safe. And in fact, they'd figured that out with their villages already, and all their villages were at least a certain distance above the river to avoid being flooded. So he put in the bridge in July and August of 1861, and it turned out that fall was the start of the heaviest rainfall that was ever recorded up there or in Western California, or in fact, in the whole West Coast. It rained so much that it turned the Central Valley into a lake that was 300 miles long in solid water. And in Sacramento, Leland Stanford had just been elected governor, and he had to go to his inauguration in the middle of this flood. So he's living in the governor's mansion, but he had to go over to the Capitol in Sacramento to do the formal ceremony, and he had to go by boat between that. And needless to say, there are big problems up here. And what happened was that that bridge at Martin's Ferry washed out. So Martin lost his bridge, all his money. And then they put in a ferry. That's how the name became Martin's Ferry instead of Martin's Bridge. And there was a hotel that was put in there. And then you did have the ferry, and eventually they rebuilt the bridge. But if you go out there today, you don't see any sign of a town. All you see is a modern bridge, and you don't have any idea, where the old bridge was. But apparently it was about 93 feet above the bottom of the river, and that canyon filled up that much. So we're about at the time, it's 3:01. It's about time for me to stop the presentation. But if there are questions from anyone, I'll answer those. And if not, we'll just finish up here. Anything?
What's the status of the tan oaks down in southern Humboldt now? Have they recovered at all?
Yeah, Rusty's asking about the status of the tan oaks in southern Humboldt. That's a really good question, because that area was just really, really hit, And what you see nowadays is that a lot of places you have small tan oaks that are maybe 20 feet high and kind of understory trees. But in Bull Creek, remember I was telling you about Bull Creek and how it's kind of in this enclosed canyon. At the northern ridge above Bull Creek, there's I think it was a 40-acre parcel that was never cut, and it was almost pure tan oak. And for some reason, the owner never sold the rights or whatever, and so the park took it over before it was ever cut. And it's a heck of a hike. It's about 7 miles to get there, but if you get up there, it's a mature tan oak forest, and just amazing. Some of the trees are 150 feet tall, and some of them are like 4 feet in diameter. You never see tan oaks like that, in any of the cutover areas. And I've heard there's another spot out near the Trinity County line that's kind of like that. But that's the only place I've ever seen, the really big trees. But they are going to, gradually come back in many of these locations now. Most places where they had cut them down and you go now, they are nowhere near being mature. And one problem is that like conifers have grown in and overtopped, so they, don't do it. And I shouldn't just make you think that all the tan oaks were down in southern Humboldt, because there were a lot, up on Redwood Creek and other places in the north too, but especially down in southern Humboldt. Okay, anything else? Okay, I guess I'll do it. Okay, well, thanks very much. And make sure, to come in and take a look at this map. Now, this has been recorded, and the camera was able to zero in on some of these places, so probably the recording is going to show some of this up much closer than you could see it or I could see it from here. So if somebody wants to view the recording, can you tell them how they would access it?
So if you go on... So if you go onto the Clarke YouTube channel, you will be able to find this today's recording.
Okay. So it'll be about an hour long. Mm-hmm. And like I said, we were looking at the Zoom capability before the program started, and you'll be able to see, in many cases, the actual words, the names of places that here are kind of a blur, especially in the upper part of the map. So that's kind of a free, kind of a bonus that you get from the program today. Okay, so thanks again, And we'll probably do something like this sometime in the future. There's many other ways you can use this map. Yeah, okay.